Welcome everyone to today's meeting, meeting number 9 of the Standing Committee on Procedure and House Affairs. The committee meets today to hear a briefing from the Chief Electoral Officer. I would like to remind all participants that no screenshot or photo of your screen is allowed.
Has the public health guidelines that have been provided with them. So I will take your heads nodding and thumbs up as a signal that you have read them and that we will all follow them. And to keep our time together at a maximum for exchanging information, I will now turn the screen over. Oh, I will just remind everyone that all comments are to be made through the chair. And the more that we can address our comments to the chair, the less you will hear from the chair. So with that, I will pass the virtual screen over to our guest today, which we are really excited to have. So we've got with us Monsieur Stéphane Perrault, Chief Electoral Officer, who is accompanied by Michel Roussel, Deputy Chief Electoral Officer, Electoral Events and Information. And I understand it'll be Mr. Perrault providing comments for approximately 6 minutes. Over to you. Welcome to PROC.
Merci, Madame la Présidente.
Thank you, Madam Chair, for the opportunity to speak with the committee today about the 44th general election. While no election is like any other, it is safe to say that this was one of the most challenging in our history. And I would like to say at the very outset that I express my gratitude to the 338 returning officers and their staff, as well as the 195,000 Canadians, citizens who served their fellow citizens to the best of their ability in difficult circumstances.
That we would be in a position to deliver a safe election, and I can confirm that this was the case. A range of measures to protect electors and poll workers were implemented in consultation with public health authorities across the country, and we continue to adjust those measures throughout the election as the situation evolved locally. Various service options were also offered to long-term care facilities and seniors' homes to reflect the needs and circumstances of each institution and to serve electors who reside there. While the election was safe, the pandemic presented a number of challenges. These were not unforeseen. As I indicated to this committee prior to the election, recruitment and training of poll workers, as well as securing polling places, were the main concerns, and they proved to be difficult. This was particularly true of polling place. In a normal election, approximately half of the electors would be assigned to vote at a nearby school. This time, schools and other usual polling places were generally unavailable. In preparing for the election, returning officers had to work to identify and to confirm alternative locations. However, once the election was called, several landlords who had earlier indicated that they would rent to us reversed their decision in the context of the emerging fourth wave. Difficulties in confirming polling locations led to delays in issuing voter information cards. This did not prevent us from increasing the number of advance polls by 18% to meet an expected increase in early voting. But it did have an impact on services on polling day, especially in some urban centers around Toronto in particular, where the scarcity of polling places and recruitment challenges led to longer wait times. To support recruitment, our enhanced national recruitment campaign emphasized the measures in place to protect the health and safety of election workers. At the local level, there were efforts to recruit bilingual election workers and those in Indigenous communities. Overall, we, however, recruited 15% fewer poll workers than in the previous election. Apart from these overarching challenges, there were specific areas where our services were below expectations. Students in particular were disappointed that we were unable to offer vote on campus kiosks. This initiative had been first piloted in 2015 and deployed more broadly in 2019, but in each case, it did require many months of planning and coordinating with post-secondary institutions. Pandemic circumstances and the lack of a fixed date election meant that we were unable to offer it this time. Our goal moving forward is to make campus kiosks part of our permanent service offering. As with previous elections, returning officers reached out to all First Nation communities in their electoral districts to arrange polling operations. Unfortunately, some First Nation electors in parts of Kenora in Ontario were unable to vote as a result of errors and miscommunications. I apologize to those electors, and we are putting in place measures to improve our services to First Nations communities across Canada. Enfin, plusieurs mesures ont été.
Finally, several measures were implemented to assist voters who wish to vote by mail, including a new online application system, prepared postage, a special information campaign, and a ballot drop-off service at local polls. This is something that was inspired by Bill C-19. And procedures were also put in place to ensure the integrity of the process, which meant that the preliminary voting results took several days to complete. Knowing that the election results would not all be available on election night this time, and in the shadow of inaccurate information surrounding the 2020 U.S. election, we took steps to maintain confidence in the process and results. We communicated early and often, and were very transparent about the measures we put in place to make voting accessible and secure, as well as to ensure its integrity. I believe that this level of transparency was instrumental in preserving trust in the election. Preliminary results from our post-election surveys indicate that voter satisfaction and trust was very high. Now, I will speak very briefly about the ongoing electoral boundaries redistribution exercise. Canada has a robust process to ensure that the periodic redrawing of electoral boundaries is done in an independent and nonpartisan manner. In October, I announced that the number of seats in the House of Commons will increase to 342. This figure is calculated as required by law using the July 1, 2021 population estimates provided by the Chief Statistician and a formula found in the Constitution. I would like to remind members that the calculation done to determine the number of seats allocated to each province is a mathematical operation over which I exercise no discretionary authority. The 10 independent commissions were created last fall. Their work began on February the 9th with the receipt of the census population numbers. So, over the next 10 months, each commission will develop boundary proposals, hold public hearings where members of the public and MPs may make presentations, and complete a report on the new electoral districts. These reports will be submitted to the Speaker for tabling in the House of Commons and referred to this committee starting in the fall of 2022. So, while my team has certainly made technical briefings and will continue to do so over the coming weeks, so we'll be able to give you further detail about the whole process of boundary redrawing. I thank you for giving me this opportunity to speak to you, and I'm happy to answer any questions.
Merci beaucoup.
Thank you so much for your comments.
Start into round one, which is 6-minute rounds, starting with Mr. Duncan, followed by Mr. Turnbull, et puis Mr. Barsalou-Duval.
And then Mr. Barsalou-Duval.
Mr. Duncan, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and through you, thank you, Mr. Perot, for being here today and for meeting with me. I think it was a couple months ago, lose track of time. But want to follow up in the report on page 40. You had the last estimated cost of the election at $630 million. That was a month ago. Do you have an updated number at this point?
The number at this point remains an estimate of 630. It's an estimate because not all costs, for example, reimbursement of candidates and parties are not complete as we do the audits, but I'm fairly confident in that figure.
Thank you. One of the things that was having the chance to read the report that you tabled to us about the challenge with special ballots and the number that weren't returned on time. Both there was a significant number, both from those that applied within riding, but a larger number from those outside the country or outside their riding. Can you talk about some of the changes you're looking at implementing to get that percentage of returns up higher in future elections? And would you also agree with me that in our country, the geographic challenge of Canada Post, of getting somebody submitting a ballot in BC or Yukon, getting it to Ottawa by the date of the election, is perhaps a logistical challenge that we have?
I'm going to just jump in real quick and remind all members that we will make comments through the chair.
So Thank you, Madam Chair. Just a point of clarification. For electors voting in their electoral districts by mail, one of the aspects that was in place is that they voted locally, in the sense that the mail was sent to the local returning officer so as to prevent that transit time from wherever they are to Ottawa. So this is only out of district electors that vote and send their ballots nationally. I did and indicate in my remarks a range of measures that we put in place to reduce the number of late ballots. I'm not going to repeat them. Obviously, any late ballot is unfortunate. These are people who wanted to cast a ballot, who cast a ballot, but we were not able to count them. I had recommended a longer election period. If you look at the results from the table 4 in the report, it shows that there was a much lower percentage of late ballots with just a few days. Now, that's not the only factor. I had also recommended that ballots received 1 day after close of the polls be counted, and this was indeed part of Bill C-19. This is something that we may want to look at in the future. I think we'll need to, on our side, to look at our communication strategy. Was it aggressive enough? I know that in Canada, at the federal level, electors who vote by mail or by special ballot must writing the name of the candidate. They cannot vote by writing in the name of the party. That is not so in some of the provinces. So that means that people who apply early have to wait until the close of nominations to see the full slate of candidates. And again, that is something that we could look at to change the rules so that voting by party would be acceptable, such that we could promote vote by mail much more aggressively in the early stages of the campaign. So, I mean, we've never had such a large scale vote by mail operation, and we're looking at every angle to see how it can be improved in the future.
Thank you for that. And one of the things you addressed the question about the time frame. That was a supplemental that I had through you, Madam Chair. But also, I think one of the things as well, again, I think geographically with the country, of all the ballots coming back to one location, there's a difference between myself, for an example, in Stormont, Dundas, South Glengarry, the mail taking it to get back to Ottawa. I have more time to safely deliver that in the mail to get to Ottawa as per se in British Columbia or in the north. So I think for more remote communities. So I think that's something that Elections Canada needs to look at in the future, of perhaps decentralizing where the ballots are received or considered received by Election Day, and would leave that for your consideration. One of the things you'd mentioned was that, yes, the pandemic created, the unnecessary pandemic election created an opportunity, or an unfortunate opportunity, where we had less polling locations. Can we get a commitment from you today? Hopefully we're not into another election during a pandemic for multiple reasons, but regardless of that, whether it's considered a pandemic election or not, is Elections Canada committed to increasing the number of polling locations across the country again back to more than normal?
I can assure you that we have done all we could in the last election, and we will do again everything that we can to increase the number of polling locations at any election. One of the considerations there that I put forward was that having a vote on a Monday eliminates the school, practically speaking. So that is something to consider for the future. If we want to have schools available, we may have to abandon Monday voting. Now, that is something for Parliament to decide, and of course, we'll administer the election in whichever way Parliament chooses. But we will continue to look for all alternative ways of finding polling locations. Madam Chair, I would note that in this election, we had some quite unusual polling locations. We had, soccer stadiums. We had the Olympic Stadium in Montreal. We had commercial premises, IKEA stores, Costco centers. So I don't think there was a lack of creativity on the part of returning officers, but the reality is that there are only so many places that are available that meet accessibility standards, and that can be open to us on a Monday.
And then just in the interest of time, I'll get to one other angle that I raised with you before in our meeting a couple of months ago, is the cross-training of election officials at polling sites. And no matter how many days of advanced polls or hours and service that you provide to people, the unfortunate reality from a logistical perspective is that you need to, everybody will show up the first day of the first hour. And one of the challenges is we had people working at doors, greeting or providing hand sanitizer or doing something. We had one person working the list at an advanced poll table, and the line was so long out the door, it created massive challenges. Would you agree that the cross-training of employees, so during busy times, a door greeter could come off and perhaps get voters out the door quicker, having cast a ballot? I firmly believe there's several Canadians, I won't say a number, but many people left and didn't vote because they saw the lines being too long and didn't bother going back. Any feedback or comments you'd have on that would be appreciated.
Certainly anything that can be done to reduce the lineups is an important thing to look at. Training is a challenge. We offer 3 hours of training for poll workers. It is difficult to offer more training than that. We ask our poll supervisors to attend training for all positions, and we can certainly look at increasing opportunities for additional training. It's not clear to me how much progress we'll be able to make, but training is one aspect. The logistics of the poll is another. I think when we talked, I've indicated my interest in introducing some technology at the poll, like is done in provincial jurisdiction, to manage the list in ways that are more efficient. So we'll look at different ways to manage the service to make it more effective for electors. At the end of the day, we certainly want to reduce those lineups.
Thank you. We'll turn the floor over to Mr. Turnbull.
Thanks, Madam Chair, and thank you to you, Mr. Perot, for being here. It's good to see you, and thanks for your report. I thought it was really detailed. I wanted to ask you a question. Well, I have a number of questions, as always, but I know that Minister LeBlanc sent you a letter last year asking you to look into the issue of hate groups and the potential for them to register as political parties in order to get privileged access to important legitimate tools for political parties like tax rebates and the list of electors. Can you speak to the work that has been undertaken since then to address these issues?
So thank you for the question.
Point of order. I don't mean to be rude, but that wasn't through the chair. I just thought we just need to have some consistent enforcement whenever we have that, Madam Chair. I don't mean to be impartial or question your impartiality, but that wasn't through the chair. Thanks.
But as a follow-up,
I had given you 2 rounds before I jumped in,
you,
so
Madam
I'm
Chair.
going to see the same. Thank you for your assistance always.
I won't do it.
Mr. Perot?
You did the
Thank
same
you, Madam
thing.
Chair.
You never even did.
So this is a matter of concern to me that hate groups not be able to use the privileges afforded in the Canada Elections Act and the Income Tax Act, whether it's lists of electors, whether it's access to special platforms, broadcasting time, or tax credits. So I have been looking into this. I have a recommendation report coming in April, and that will be an aspect of the report. It's a difficult issue, and I think it's not for the Chief Electoral Officer to arbitrate between groups, but there may be mechanisms that we can put forward that would at least allow some safeguards against hate groups getting access to those privileges. So I look forward to sharing that with the members of Parliament.
Yeah, look forward to definitely hearing progress on any safeguards that can be put in place, because it is deeply concerning to think about, what effects that would have on our democratic institutions if that happens. I also note that in your report on page 33, you mentioned that there were 111 incidents of security issues, I guess, and I think 78 of them on page 34 required police intervention. This seems, quite concerning. Can you tell us about those events, and can you speak to the role of hateful rhetoric that political parties use, specifically the official opposition, in contributing to these kinds of events? Through you, Madam Chair.
Thank you, Madam Chair. So obviously for us, it was quite disquieting to see some of the behavior we saw at the polls. This was not something that we have seen in the past, and certainly not to that extent and the level of vitriol was quite disappointing. Canadians working at the polls are just ordinary Canadians serving fellow citizens for one day, and often they're seniors. So it is disturbing to see the level of aggressivity that we saw during this election. I think much of it was related to tensions around COVID and COVID measures, and I'm hopeful, though not fully confident, that it will go down in the future. But if we want to have poll workers, we need to have voters respect the poll workers who come and work to serve them during the election. That's the nature of our democracy.
Point of order, Madam Chair.
Yes.
Did Mr. Turnbull, if I understand correctly, just accuse the official opposition of committing crimes during the election? Thank you.
I understand that we're in a response. So are you referring to the question? I did not hear that within his commentary. So I'm going to let Mr. Pro finish and go through this exchange of time. And then if we need to address it between questioners, we can definitely get to that. Mr. Pro, back to you.
Thank you. I was just sharing how I think in Canada, we cherish the degree of civility that we normally experience when we go at the poll, that we all know that most people in a room may disagree with us and don't vote the same way, but there's a level of respect. Il y a une sérénité, là, excusez-moi en anglais.
Serenity, excuse my French.
Takes place and that we need to maintain. So it was disturbing to see that, and hopefully we need to nurture a more civil behavior at the polls. So there was a fair amount of aggressivity, a few cases of physical assault, and that's not what we want to see.
Thank you, Mr. Pro. I certainly note that the level of vitriol in the past election seemed to be far greater than the one before. And certainly experienced much of that aggression and rhetoric in my community, and deeply concerning for volunteers as well that are participating who don't sign up for that kind of treatment. So deeply concerning for me. I also, along the similar line of questioning to Mr. Duncan, I'll ask you a question about some of the special or mail-in ballots. I note that in your report on page 25, there were just over 114,000 special or mail-in ballots not returned or canceled. Can you provide some insight as to what would cause this discrepancy? And for instance, is it safe to assume that some Canadians requested a mail-in ballot and then decided to vote in person? Just to add to that, if you have a chance, is 9% cancellation or non-return rate traditionally high, or is it about average? Thanks very
and
much.
we'll take that comment through the chair, and I can now understand, Mr. Pro, the frustration and difficulty because we've been having elections for so long. This committee has now been meeting several times, and I'm still working on making sure comments are addressed through the chair. Mr. Pro.
Thank you. So the percentages of canceled or not returned ballots is higher than in the past. If you look at the table at the next page, it was 4% in the last election. Here it's at 9%. There is a difference, though. In this election, I did make some adaptations to the act because of the unique circumstances, and did allow an elector who would show up on polling day and who had received a kit, would applied for special ballot, but perhaps it received it too late and perhaps did not quite understand that there was a drop box service. We did not turn those voters away. We had them swear an oath and we allowed them to vote.
Point of order, Madam Chair. There's a lot of side chatter going. My apologies. There's a lot of side chatter in the room and I can't actually hear the witness. Thank you.
Okay, so I'm just going to remind members that we are in committee. We are in a public committee, and we have asked these witnesses to come and exchange with us today. And I recognize that tensions are high, but this is not what we've usually come across. So I'm just going to ask us to take a breath and refocus on committee, PROC committee, talking about the election with the Chief Electoral Officer. Mr. Pro, the screen is yours.
Thank you, Madam Chair. As I was explaining, the unique circumstances of this election meant that I adapted the legislation. So an elector who would come up on polling day, had applied for a special ballot, had not brought it, misunderstood the drop box service that we had, was allowed to vote, swore an oath that he or she did not vote. And we confirmed that by checking after the election, before the count was completed, that no special ballot had in fact been cast. The separation within the 114,000 between those who simply chose not to vote and those who chose to vote by another means is something that we need to look into. But to do that, we need to pry open all of the bags coming back from all the parts of the country. So that's a long process, but I'm confident that we will be able to report on that in the breakdown between those who chose not to vote and those who chose to vote otherwise.
Thank you for that exchange. Mr. Viss, before I go to Mr. Barcelou Duval, I will just remind all committee members to be mindful of tone and commentary. We are here to obtain information so that we can improve our institutions and our systems. But Mr. Viss, your comments have been noted, and I will definitely be more attentive to what you are asking. Avec ça, Mr. Barcelou Duval.
With that, Mr. Barcelou Duval, you have the floor. Thank you so much, Madam Chair, and I'd like to thank Mr. Perrault as well for being with us today. It's very much appreciated, and what he does as Chief Electoral Officer is certainly appreciated as well. I congratulate him on his work. He's faced many challenges in the context of the election. I know that there were some problems, but overall it was a success, I would say, because there is enormous trust that is still given to our electoral system. There are questions that I would like to ask that may appear as criticism, but nonetheless, I will ask them. You've talked about the redistribution of the ridings and the redrawing of the electoral map. It's something that's of great concern for us in Quebec because Quebec would lose one seat. There is a minimum weight, I believe, that should be attributed to the voice of Quebec in Ottawa. It should not be something discretionary to redraw the number of ridings per province. So I'm raising this because given the particularity of Quebec, given what has the weight of Quebec here in Parliament, is there any way of having a relative weighting to recognize the voice of Quebec? Mr. Barcelou Duval, I welcome you to our meeting today, but remind you that you must address your questions to the witness through me. Yes, I think so we have to look at this at the merits each time, but we look back at what was done in past elections, and we carry out our work. But with respect to the question, there are proposals that are often mentioned, but it's a mathematical formula, as I mentioned in my opening remarks. It's just that. That's all it is. Our Constitution recognizes the general principle of proportionality in the provinces, and they do make arrangements for certain smaller provinces given certain circumstances. But within the parameters of the Constitution, we have to find the proportionality that is there. And it is not up to myself as Chief Electoral Officer to get involved in this type of debate. It will be looked at, if you like, in the legal framework that will arise from the matter. Thank you, Madam Chair. To Mr. Perrault, through you, I know that work has just begun on the redrawing of the electoral boundaries. There is a will that is perhaps expressed by Parliament with respect to this famous electoral map. Should we move more quickly on the electoral boundaries redrawing? But Parliament has seemed to indicate that they want no changes. Well, the government can bring in legislation, and I know that the Bloc Québécois is doing so. I can say this, this is a 10-year exercise that occurs every 10 years. It's not a constant. We look at it each time, but there is a review periodically. But really, this is all I can tell you. So there was no communication on the part of the government to say that there would be or there wouldn't be any type of change given the formula. No, I haven't had any communication in one direction or the other. Next question is still in the boundaries redrawing issue. My question is this. There were many complaints over the past years from constituents who say that they have been affected. We're not talking about cities of 140,000 residents. We're talking about 10,000, 14,000 residents who have been affected by certain issues, but they don't even know who to speak to. They ask who should we be speaking to if we are concerned about issues that occur because of the redrawing of boundaries. I hope that there would be some sensitivity given to this. I wouldn't like to see communities chopped up into smaller parcels. In Boucherville, it was chopped up. The whole riding was chopped up, and it wasn't a big riding to begin with. So I think that much can be done, but you do have to respect communities and their sense of community. Mr. Perrault, you have 40 seconds to answer. I'm not in disagreement with what was said, but we don't play any role in that. We don't give any directive to the electoral boundaries commissions. They do their work, and the important thing is to recognize the criteria that are held by the communities themselves. There are tools, and the Commission is very independent to use those tools in exercising its power. I in no way try to sway the Commission in its work. Thank you so much. And now, 6 minutes, Ms. Blaney.
Thank you, Madam Chair. And of course, as always, through you, I would like to ask several questions. And first of all, of course, thank our witnesses for being here today. My first question is around student participation. I know in the last election there was no voting on campus, and I heard a lot of frustration about that across my region and into other regions. And when I looked at the notes, one of the things that I read is that it felt like there wasn't enough time because the fixed election wasn't there. So I'm just trying to get clarity. Does that mean that campus voting will only be available during elections with fixed election dates? And is there no other way to start to prepare for opportunities when there may not be a fixed election date? This just seems like a huge significant loss for young voters to be engaged.
Thank you, Madam Chair, for the question. I hope I can speak to it fully because it is an important issue, and campus kiosks are an initiative that we put forward because we believe that it's an important one. Now, I just want to do a minor correction. There was voting on campuses, certainly for those who resided there in some locations, and there were returning offices near most campuses, if not on the campus, and many times within the perimeters of the campus. But what there was not is the special ballot campus kiosks that we offered for the first time at a national scale in 2019, and I do wish to offer that in the future. Now, the context of this election was somewhat unique. When we began planning for it in the summer, essentially of 2020, in the pandemic, campuses were closed. So there's no option there of working with post-secondary institutions to set up arrangements for locations. They were not in that mindset, and nor was anybody else. And as we evolved in the pandemic, and as we got to the summer prior to the election, and there was talk about opening campuses, it's only then in June that we began looking at ways to do that. So certainly right now we're in a different situation. We will start communications with campuses very shortly to try to settle in advance on agreements with locations for locations to hold campus kiosks, even if it's a snap election. So certainly my goal for the fall would be, if there is a fall election, would be to have campus voting with special kiosks. But I do emphasize the fact that it has proven to be difficult in the past to obtain arrangements. It's easy to get commitment from universities and their agreement in principle. It's much more difficult to negotiate the lease arrangements, the legal parameters of the arrangements, so that we can have an agreement. And it's even harder if we don't know when that vote will take place. So we will do our best efforts, and certainly my commitment that we move towards having campus kiosks in any election. But I do want to manage expectation. It is possible that we will face difficulties in a minority context.
Well, thank you, Madam Chair. I really appreciate the witness's answer. Another question that I have is really specifically around rural and remote communities. I didn't see a lot of information in the report that addressed that specifically, and as a member of Parliament that represents a larger riding in British Columbia, and also a lot of small communities that are in some very remote locations, some locations that take more than just a ferry, boats to get there. I'm just wondering if you could talk about what challenges we're seeing in those communities, because I've heard anecdotally in my region, a lot of the people that usually work on elections were older, concerned about COVID, didn't feel safe to be doing the work that they either were paid or volunteered to do. And I expect that if I was hearing that in my riding, Madam Chair, they must have been hearing that in other parts of the country. So if I could just hear about the challenges that are facing rural and remote communities, and sort of what actions you are taking, sorry, Madam Chair, the witness is taking to address those very challenges.
Thank you. It's a very important question. I hope I can do it justice. There has been a growing gap in the service offering between what Canadians in rural Canada and remote parts of the country receive and what we're seeing in urban Canada. If you go back 20 years to the 37th general election in 2000, 3.5% of the voters voted at advanced polls. Last election was 35%. They voted over 2 days then, now it's 4 days. That evolution is an evolution that's very urban. It's what we see in Toronto, it's what we see in suburbs across the country. But the service offering is not improved in remote parts of the country. And part of the challenge, or I would say the main challenge, has been a mix of legal and operational. The recruitment that you mentioned is a challenge in those remote parts of the country. And we did ask for amendments to the Act, which we did receive, that now allow me, by exception, to permit single days or 2 days of advance vote in parts of the country where the population and the workforce does not allow for 4 full days. So rather than being, all or nothing, 0 days or 4 days of advance polls, it can be 1 or 2 days. What we need to do is stop using those new provisions in a reactive way, as we've done in the last 2 elections, and start planning more aggressively for single or dual days of advance polls in those remote parts of the country. And that does impact directly First Nations communities. So when we look at services to First Nations communities, having planned days of advance vote, even if it's just 1 day, rather than waiting for a request and planning for 0 or 4, I think can make a big difference. And that is what we're currently working to roll out for the next election. I think that will be a significant improvement.
Thank you. We will now enter into round 2, starting with Mr. Barrett, followed by Mr. Fergus, et puis Mr. Barcelou-Duval, Ms. Blaney, Mr. Viss, Mrs. Romanado. Mr. Barrett, 5 minutes to you.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Through you, I'd like to thank Messrs. Perot and Roussel for being here today. and thank Mr. PROC for taking the time to meet with me as a member of this committee earlier in this session. Through you, Madam Chair, to the witnesses, I'd like to discuss instances of foreign interference in this last election. So there was a lot of reporting in Global News, the Toronto Star, about various instances, ridings in Ontario like Aurora, Oak Ridges, Richmond Hill, or in British Columbia like Steveston, Richmond East, where there were reports of anonymous misinformation campaigns using social media channels like WeChat. Global News reported in one of their articles that CSIS had said that the intelligence community didn't detect foreign interference threats that rose to the level of jeopardizing Canada's ability to hold a, quote, free and fair election, quote, and that they didn't warrant warning the public, but that they were, quote, aware of them and remain vigilant of these activities. So my question, Madam Chair, to the witnesses is if they're aware of instances, and if they can quantify them, and if there was an increase between the 2019 and 2021 elections of instances of foreign interference.
So thank you, Madam Chair. I'll try to answer it the best that I can this question. We know we work, as you probably know, with the security and intelligence community at the federal level, as well as with provincial police to secure the election. This is a responsibility that is shared by several agencies and institutions, and we each have a different role to play. What I can say is first that there has been no cyber breaches of our electoral systems, IT infrastructure in this election. There has been a fair amount of misinformation and disinformation about the electoral process, and including misinformation about COVID measures at the polls. Now, this is an area of focus for my agency, and we do monitor social media in that respect, and we have responded and corrected and pushed out correct information so that we can ensure that voters have all the right information about the voting process. I am aware of the reports that you've mentioned regarding possibly foreign interference through organic content, whether social media or foreign language media at the local level. Obviously, this is a matter of concern to the sovereignty of our elections. But with respect to the application of the Elections Act, this is not something that involves any of the rules in the Act. It is something that is of interest, no doubt, to our intelligence community and to global affairs in terms of the relationship with foreign entities. But I'm not aware of instances of foreign interference that would involve breaches of the Canada Elections Act.
Okay. Madam Chair, I thank the witness for the response. I want to take, I see that I've got about a minute left. I just take a moment to put a motion on notice and provide that to members of the committee. And that's being sent to the clerk now, and I have paper copies for the clerk to distribute in the room in both official languages. And this notice of motion for consideration at a future meeting is that the committee, pursuant to Standing Order 108, Sub 3, Sub A, Sub 6, conduct a study concerning foreign interference in Canadian elections, provided that A, the Chief Electoral Officer and the Commissioner of Canada Elections be invited to appear jointly for 2 hours at a televised meeting at their earliest opportunity. B, the Chief of the Communication Security Establishment and the Director of the... Thank you. Director of the Canadian Security Intelligence Service be invited to appear jointly for 2 hours at their earliest opportunity, provided that 1 hour be televised and the other hour be in camera. And C, the parties represented on the committee submit their list of proposed witnesses in order of priority. And I think with that, Madam Chair, I've exhausted my time. Through you, Chair, to the witnesses, thanks very much for attending today and for taking the time to answer our questions.
Thank you for that notice of motion, Mr. Barrett. Mr. PROC, did you want to make a quick comment?
No, I think I'll leave it at that.
Brilliant. Thank you so much. Now we will move on to Mr. Fergus, 5 minutes.
Merci beaucoup, Madame la Présidente, puis j'aimerais aussi.
Thank you very much, Chair. And through you, Madam Chair, I would like to thank the witnesses for being here, Mr. Perrault and Mr. Roussel. We certainly appreciate the work that you and your colleagues do. For Elections Canada, it's remarkable work, it's excellent work. And I think that my colleague, Mr. Barcelot Duval, said it very well with respect to the services that are available given the situation. The services were excellent. Madam Chair, through you, I hope you will note that if I forget to say so, each question that I ask really is intended to be asked through you. So here is my first question. It deals with mail-in ballots, voting by mail. I found that something really exceptional. It was experience for me, the first time, in fact, for me, during this past election. It was something that was particularly useful given the fact that we were in a pandemic and many people weren't able to leave their homes. So I'd like to know, to your mind, what other tools would you need to promote even better this possibility of voting by mail? Well, I don't know. Let me say this. Voting by mail, it was said it was there to facilitate things, and the results really astonished me. 97% of the people polled thought that this was something really useful. It was intended to alleviate the burden of an election during a pandemic. But let me say, the first thing that comes to mind is this, and as I mentioned earlier, Madam Chair, people who vote with a special ballot, they have to vote for a candidate, not a party. In view of the fact that 18 days before the election, when the list was officially completed and drawn up, it doesn't leave a lot of time. So during the first period of time preparing that election, we found fewer voted by post initially because they didn't really know who the candidates were. And I'm sorry to have to say this, that they didn't know the candidates by name. But the information is there. But we didn't maybe pursue it aggressively enough. But 44% of what was approved on the 18th day was the figure. That compares 68% in the UK. The principal difference with the UK is there they vote for a party. So they can promote more aggressively their party during the election campaign, and they allow voters to vote earlier on in the electoral process. I would just like to clarify this because it seems to have created some confusion. Voting by mail does not go through Ottawa. No, it goes directly to the commission. I interrupt. I'm sorry, Madam Chair. I have 2 minutes left, do I? 1 minute left. So very quickly then, sir, I'd like to know this. During the voting period on weekends, I think perhaps that, like you, it should be moved to the weekends to encourage people to vote, to give more possibility of bringing in more voters. Do you have any comments on that? Is that something that you still would like to see happen? That is a Sunday voting, for example, or Saturday voting. Saturday voting. Well, it's not up to me. You can look at the report for recommendations, but for remote areas, 2 days of advance poll is really important, but it would be difficult to do that, perhaps, what you are asking for in remote areas. So what can we do for remote areas, did you say? It wouldn't be very possible because they are not heavily populated. If you have it on a weekend, it gives rise to other issues. But that's a very good example. I don't want the members and witnesses to speak directly to each other because the interpreters have great difficulty doing their work. So I would ask you once again to address your comments to the chair, because when two people talk at the same time, it's not good because we have to respect both official languages, and it's very important for our interpreters to be able to do their work. Mr. Fergus, I'd just like to know if we could, during our discussion in camera, on committee matters, if we should perhaps extend the periods of time, because, you know, just 6 minutes, it's very difficult to have a conversation with a witness. I've looked at the time that I've allotted for all members, and I know that all feel that it passes very quickly with the amounts. But yes, of course, we could always have that conversation in camera. With that, Mr. Barcelou-Duval, you have 2.5 minutes. Thank you very much, Madam Chair. I'd just like to tell Mr. Perrault about a situation in my riding, which probably is something that can occur elsewhere. For example, there was a CHLD in my riding that didn't have a voting place. And I can also talk about they weren't able to vote. Another example, advance polls, for example. So when you have your advance poll that occurs before the vote that is set up in the CHLD, it blocks it blocks up the advance poll. And so for these two situations that I have described, they're very long wait lines, of course. What do you say? Because, you know, the objective is to get every person to vote. And I have another subject that I'd like to bring up. You may not have time to answer this. In another case, in Rue Sainte-Marie, there was an enormous wait time. In Varennes, there were people who turned around and left because they had to wait hours upon hours in line to be able to vote. So it was because there was only one person at the table to oversee the voting and hand out the ballots, and so it was very difficult. Of course, that corresponds specifically rather to the difficulty of holding an election in a pandemic when people want to vote too, but it is a problem. Mr. Perrault, thank you, Madam Chair. These are concerns that I certainly share with respect to what occurred at the RPA. We want to be able to provide greater flexibility in the legislation. If each RPA or CHLD decides about the way in which the vote will take place, we know that there are some that voted in a traditional fashion, but there were others where there was like a rolling vote, where there was a moving vote, where people went to get the vote from them. And so the vast majority, though, voted before polling day. 19% voted by special ballot with assistance, and many voted at the advance poll without assistance. I know it's more difficult for elderly people, but there are circumstances that have to be taken into consideration. I know that the residents' home in your riding where there are many elderly people, well, there was only a drop of 2%. On the macro level, there was very little variation, but the question is really this: are we going to continue to allow this flexibility, which normally is not allowed for under the terms of the legislation, to provide on an ongoing basis more flexibility? With respect to wait lines, look, the average does not really translate to the experience of a voter who had to wait hours upon hours in line. There were exceptional cases in the country, but overall it went rather well. But it wasn't the same for all voters. We have a model for independent workers. It's one that could be accelerated, but if you only have one worker there, you have to ask yourself what would be the best combination if you adjust that. You want to be able to have people access the polling station and the polling booth adequately. There are a variety of variables that can be taken into consideration, but I appreciate the fact that it wasn't a good experience for all Canadians in the context of the pandemic. Thank you. Madame Blaney, you have the floor.
Thank you, Madam Chair. And through you, I would like to ask the witnesses a little bit more about Indigenous participation. Of course, in the write-up we got here, there was mention about the First Nations and electorals in Kenora and Ontario, but I do know that a lot of Indigenous communities had no way to vote, for example, First Nations on reserve or accessible. I'm just wondering if the committee could hear if this is because of the pandemic, if there's other barriers, and what are they, and what is the strategy moving forward to make sure that those barriers are removed. And another question I have, just to go back to both Indigenous communities and rural and remote communities, is the infrastructure limits. You know, I think of looking for spaces to set up a place to do the elections can sometimes be challenging. It was mentioned in the report about Bella Coola, and I know there was particular challenges there, but I imagine those are experienced in those smaller communities. And just to further that question with the idea of having advanced polls be a little more flexible, just want to make sure that that process is happening, and if there's anything this committee needs to recommend that would help that process be cleaner and smoother for rural and remote communities, but also for Indigenous communities across the country.
Through the chair, Mr. Perot.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Certainly, we have the tools to make advanced polls more available, and that is something that's happening right now. So we are working on this. Now, stepping back here and talking about First Nations communities across Canada, of course, this is an area where, as I said in my report and in my remarks, we need to improve. The service offering to First Nation communities has, generally speaking, not gone down in this election. The problem is the growing delta between the service offering to those communities and the rest of Canadians, and that delta is quite visible to those communities, and that is something that needs to be addressed. Every election, returning officers contact First Nations communities in their electoral district. They contact 100% of them, and they reach out to them prior to the election, and they did this case in June and July, and they did reach out to all communities once the writ are issued. Now, in a significant number of cases, 57% this time around, First Nation communities said that they did want to have polling services on in their community. In roughly 40% of the cases, election after election, leaders in the communities have a decision to make, and they decide that for their community, they do not wish to have voting services in the community. And that's something that we have always respected and will always respect. There's a long, of course, history behind that choice. In many cases, the service offering is right outside of the community, just outside of the reserves. Some of these reserves are close to urban areas, and that works well. In other cases, it works not so well. There's a greater distance. So each case is unique, but in this election was, in that regard, not much different than other elections. As I said, I think where we need to improve first is to increase the number of advanced polling opportunities so that First Nations have that same or similar flexibility that most Canadians have, and currently that is not the case. So this is something that we can do fairly quickly. Longer term, we need to look back, and we're in the process right now of building a team which will include persons from First Nations communities to look at the way that we engage with and communicate with First Nations communities. How do we understand their realities and their needs? How do we better build bridges between those communities and Elections Canada to ensure that the service offering is adequate and that it is well communicated? Certainly, when we look back at Kenora, there were both communications problems, there were problems with understanding the needs of the community, and there were problems in terms of the service offering at advanced polls. And these are problems that are I think widespread. So it will take more time there. We were building a team to examine in depth how we engage with and communicate with First Nations, but we don't need to wait years to start taking action. There are things that we are putting in place right now to improve services.
Thank you, Mr. Perot. Now the floor to Mr. Viss for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. And through you, Madam Chair, I'd like to pose 2 questions during my time today. On page 34 of the report, it specifically references my riding. It states that electors who were evacuated from Lytton, British Columbia could vote in person at polls in Spence's Bridge in the closest community, or by mail, or at a local Elections Canada office if they had self-evacuated farther away. This was very problematic in my riding. The Elections Canada, Madam Chair, was asking voters to go into an area that was at imminent threat of a forest fire. It was not safe for people to be traveling to Spence's Bridge. So, Madam Chair, I am very concerned that Elections Canada didn't treat this issue with more seriousness and offer an option to voters to have the type of service commonly given to seniors in assisted living facilities, such as a mobile poll. This is also problematic because many of my constituents and the voters had lost their identification, had fled town with 15 minutes notice, and did not have either their vehicles or sufficient identification to vote by mail or to even go back into an area under evacuation alert, as I recall. Madam Chair, my second question relates to the issuing of leases. Throughout the report presented to us, Madam Chair, it states clearly that with the snap election, it was difficult for Elections Canada officials to find adequate places to hold the election in conjunction with the pandemic and the snap election. It says that issuing leases as well can only be issued after the writ has dropped. Madam Chair, would it be easier for Elections Canada to find suitable places for polling locations if they were able to issue leases before the writ drops? Thank you, Madam Chair.
Madam Chair, I'll start with the last question. The problem is not the lack of ability to sign a lease before writ drop. It's because without knowing the date of the election, it is not possible to secure premises for any date. So outside of a fixed in a fixed date election context, we have that ability to enter into formal agreements much earlier than when the writs are dropped. It's not the case, of course, in a snap election. So there's not much legally that can be done to assist us, unfortunately, in that regard. In the case of Lytton, I understand that it was an extremely difficult situation. I think it was difficult in many places in your district, both during and after the election with the floods. one of the challenges there is that if I understand correctly, and I'll ask my colleague, Mr. Roussel, to add to my comments, but this is a place where people are not evacuated in a particular location, as is sometimes the case, and we've seen that in Winnipeg, for example, where we know exactly where the evacuees are, and we're able to go there and serve them. So it was more challenging in Lytton.
Madam Chair,
because
I'll just intervene on that point. It was all of the evacuees, the majority of them were evacuated to Kamloops and Merritt in the adjacent electoral district. That is why during the election, I specifically requested a mobile polling station, and it was I am still at a loss why Elections Canada couldn't have been flexible for the voters, and I might add many of whom were Indigenous from Lytton First Nation to have that option.
Thank you, Madam Chair. On the record, Mr. Viss, there's about 50 seconds remaining. So Mr. Pro and then to Mr. Roussel.
Perhaps, Mr. Roussel, Michelle, you could add some elements of information here for the situation in Lytton. Normally, we do try to make use of the flexibility that we have. So, Mr. Roussel, you're on mute.
Vous êtes en sortie.
You're on mute.
Toujours. Il reste que vous.
You're still on mute.
Am I good?
We are.
Okay, Madam Chair, sorry for that. Unfortunately, Madam Chair, I will have to study that case and get more information on what the members has been telling us, has been recounting. So we want to get the facts straight on what the member is recounting.
That would be great. So Mr. Viss has put some comments on the record. He is available, and we would welcome that information to the committee members.
Thank you, Madam Chair. And through you, Madam Chair, I'd like to request a written response regarding my line of questioning today on the situation in Lytton specifically. Okay, good.
Perfect. Thank you all very much. And now, Ms. Romanato, 5 minutes to you. Mrs. Romanato, 5 minutes to you.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair. And through you, I'd like to thank the witnesses for being here today. I have a question with respect to voter identification cards. In the report provided to the committee, the issue of voter information cards, VICs, was highlighted on the bottom of page 16, top of page 17, where there was a delay in mailing them out because of the fact that Elections Canada did have difficulty securing polling places. And so I know for a fact that many constituents in my riding were not aware of the fact that they could still vote even though they hadn't received the voter information card, despite our efforts to educate them that they didn't need it to vote. That was something that was an issue that we heard a lot about. And also with respect to advanced poll and special ballots, that people are still under the assumption that they have to have a rationale or a reason to use those other options, so whether it be the special ballot or advanced polls, that they're under the impression they have to have a valid excuse that they can't vote on election day. Could, through you, Madam Chair, could the Chief Electoral Officer explain a little bit some of the education efforts to make sure that voters, especially new citizens to Canada, know what they can and cannot do? Thank you.
Thank you, Madam Chair. So it is quite correct that, of course, the voter information is not required. We encourage electors to bring it because it does facilitate the process. We have an information campaign that informs the electors of all the various options in order to vote. We have material in 49 languages, and I can certainly follow up with the committee on the measures we take to inform new Canadians, because we do have measures in place. It is unfortunate that still some would be under the impression that they cannot vote without a voter information card. Clearly, that is not the case. Similarly, I have to say I'm somewhat surprised that electors would still believe that you need an excuse or some reason to vote at advance poll. It's been many years. And as I said earlier, we've gone from 3.5% to 35%. Quite frankly, if we continue in that direction and there's no sense of stopping, we will need longer election period because recruitment is becoming extremely difficult in the days leading up to the advance polls. We can't have half of the population voting at advance polls and train half of the poll workers in the same amount of time that we have now. So I'm not sure how to respond to that. I can certainly share with the committee the products that we use and the approach that we take to explain to voters how they need to prepare to vote at the election.
Thank you very much. And I also wanted to touch base briefly on recruiting the people to work at the polls. I know that in my writing that was an issue, that they had a lot of difficulty recruiting people to work at the polls. We had situations, and I know you referred to this in the report, sorry, through you, Madam Chair, that some employees, would just not show up or would quit on the day of advance poll, and it caused a little bit of a havoc. What are the efforts in terms of trying to recruit and train people to work at during the elections? Is there some online training that's available in between elections? And if you could elaborate a little bit on that, because we saw a lot of people who had never worked at elections before working this time, and there were it slowed down the process, and there were a lot of errors. I know just in terms of closing polls, we had people having difficulty counting ballots. So if you could elaborate, that would be great.
So in the context of the pandemic, Madam Chair, one of the challenges is not just recruit, but also training. Because when we train in person in closed classrooms with the distancing that's required, you need more space, more classrooms. So one of the things that we did in this election was augment the tools for training using new online material, online training session. I don't believe they're available as we speak, but we could make them available all the time. We also had train on your own guides to support poll workers. But clearly there were new poll workers in this election, perhaps more than other elections because of the unique circumstances. I could add that in this election, we saw 14,000 poll workers who had been recruited and trained who did not show up on polling day. In the last election, it was 10,000. I'm happy to say that we managed this much better than 10,000 because it did cause disruption the last election. We were prepared for this. We expected that people would, at the last minute, either be sick, and we asked people who are sick not to show up, or be concerned about COVID, or for other reasons decide not to show up. So there were 14,000 who did not show up. Returning officers made the calls in the days leading up to the election, firming up the commitments. And when people said that they were no longer willing to work, they had to merge polls. And basically that is a lot of the causes for the lineups around Toronto in particular, for example, when you need to combine polls, and there's a limit, of course, to how much combining one can do without creating significant lineups. So yes, that was a big challenge for us in this election. So we'll need to revisit that. I'm not sure there's any magic wand that we can wave. I don't know anybody who can recruit more than 195,000 people in 30 days and train them for a single day of work. It's quite a challenge.
Thank you very much.
Thank you so much for that exchange. And now we will enter into the third round, starting with Mr. Murillo. Welcome back to PROC. Mr. Gerritsen, Mr. Barcelou-Duval, Ms. Blaney. Mr. Murillo, 5 minutes to you.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair. I appreciate the opportunity to be back at the committee, and Mr. Pro, I appreciate you taking the time to speak to the committee today. So, Mr. Pro, I represent the riding of Kenora, which, of course, as you know, had a number of issues throughout the course of the election. I just want to, before I get to my questions, just put a bit of context onto the record as well from my experience, particularly in the far north, in the First Nations that you mentioned early on. So, the returning officer in our riding actually reached out to all of our campaigns. It was clear to every single campaign that the election day in some of the communities was essentially going to be moved. In Pikangikum specifically, this was the case to accommodate a traditional harvesting day that coincided with the election. That was clearly communicated to the campaigns, I can tell you that. So I was quite shocked to see in the days after the election that the community itself was not aware of that. I had a call from the chief of Pikangikum who told me that there was never any communication to him that that was going to be the case. In another instance in Northwest Angle, prior to election day, the chief reached out to me to ask where her polling station was. When I went to the Elections Canada website, I found out that she was actually listed as the contact for the polling location. So again, clearly a breakdown of communication, to put it mildly. But it wasn't just in the First Nations, actually. There were many other concerns as well. In Red Lake is another example where the advanced polling station that was advertised online, that was communicated to the campaigns, was actually not where the advanced polling station was. And I just found that out. I happened to be driving by, and I stopped by because there was no cars in the parking lot, and it looked like that there was no one there. And there wasn't. The polling station was not at that location. So I, trying to spread some news about that, shared the information on Facebook and was actually flagged for spreading misinformation by Elections Canada, which of course was untrue. It was actually Elections Canada that was incorrect. So all of that, I know that there's a lot to take in there, but there was clearly some widespread issues, systemic structural issues that go far beyond just one or two communities. So I guess my question to you would be, how do we explain that? Is it a function of the snap election, of the pandemic election, of a shorter writ period? How can that happen really in a general election in Canada? Through the chair.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you for the question. I share your shock and anger. If you were flagged for misinformation, that's because we were not informed of those changes. I was not aware that the polling day had been canceled. While you had been informed of the change in Pikangikum, we were not. So when you say that,
sorry, Madam Chair, can I ask who is then responsible for that decision? If you are not aware, that sounds like something that you should be aware of.
It certainly is something that I should be aware of. And so I certainly expect that if there cancellation of polling day on polling day is extraordinary and is something that needs to be communicated to headquarters. I need to know, and we need to be able to take measures to inform voters through all kinds of means. So clearly that did not take place in Kenora. You raise a number of circumstances. I'm not sure I'm aware of all those circumstances, but I recognize that there was a breakdown in communication, and that was problematic. And not all of that can be explained by COVID or the circumstance of this election. So the returning officer has moved on. He's retired. We will be recruiting, and certainly communications with local communities will rank very high on the priorities of the returning officer. And of course, communications with headquarters will be emphasized as well.
Thank you. And just one more question, I think is all I have time for, Madam Chair. I'd just like to ask if you can share a bit of information on what concrete steps you are going to take to ensure that this never happens again in Kenora or in any electoral district across the country.
Well, I've already mentioned one. I think it may be the most important one. A lot of the confusion that took place was a result of shifting days of voting because there had not been planned advance poll. Had there been at least one day of advance poll in Pikangikum or Poplar Hill or Cat Lake, the leaders there would not have had to call the returning officer and indicate that September 20th was a problem. They would have been satisfied with the existence of an alternative. The lack of an alternative to polling day was the root cause of the confusion and the error of canceling polling day in those communities. So I think that is the most important aspect, and it reaches well beyond, as I've said before, well beyond Kenora. That is something that we need to expand across Canada in remote and rural areas. I think beyond that, the issues of communications are more local. We need to reinforce, of course, the mechanisms and reinforce the importance of communicating both at headquarters and with the communities. I also mentioned that we're putting together a team that will look into how we engage with and communicate with and understand First Nations communities. And we will have members of First Nations communities involved in that team. And I certainly hope that we will have the opportunity to work closely with the communities in Kenora as part of that initiative to see how we can improve the services in the long term.
Thank you. If I can just really quickly, Mr. Pro, ask whose responsibility would it be to inform you of such a change?
If a poll is canceled on polling day, I expect the returning officer to communicate with headquarters about the cancellation so that we can put in place communications for the electors in that community.
So the returning officer would be calling Central, not calling you directly.
Correct.
Thank you for that information. Mr. Gerritsen, 5 minutes to you.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Madam Chair, my questions are for Mr. Perot on the topic of election financing. There are reports that there is a lot of money that's currently being raised by the protests and blockades that are going on in Canada right now that is coming in from foreign sources. One leaked document from one of the fundraising organizations suggests that as much as 61% of money are coming from foreign sources. If the organizers of those protests or blockades then were to go and turn around and use that money for leadership campaigns or towards election campaigns, would that be considered illegal?
Through the chair.
Yes, Madam Chair, there are existing provisions in the Act that quite clearly say that foreign funds cannot be used for regulated activities, including partisan activities, and that would include leadership races. So there is a prohibition
Thank you.
in the legislation.
Thank you. Sorry, and I did say through the chair at the beginning, so this is all through the chair. What is being done to ensure that that happens through the chair?
So let me, Madam Chair, answer in twofold. First of all, the Commissioner is the one who's responsible for looking into enforcement of the Act. Now, the facts are of course extremely important, and whether there are actual funds that are being transferred and that are in fact being used for partisan activities are all matters of facts that need to be looked into, and I cannot speak to that, but it doesn't flow necessarily from the fact that some funds have been raised and that there may be some partisan activity, that there's a connection.
Now,
I'm just going to pause the clock for a second. Mr. Pro, there is procedure where the amount of time that the questioner poses is about the time that you would take to answer. I will provide leniency, Mr. Gerritsen, when the answers are too long, if they do provide substance. So please be rest assured that you will get your answers. Mr. Gerritsen.
Thank you. By my count, I have 3 minutes left. Through you, Madam Chair. Now, what if the money that was raised was utilized by a third party? For example, there are a number of banners that are being erected around the Wellington Street area on the back of trucks that say Pierre Poilievre for Prime Minister. Now, if it was fundraising dollars through fundraising efforts that were coming in from the United States and other parts of the world that were then being used by a third party to create such banners, would that be considered illegal?
So there are prohibitions on using foreign funds for partisan activities, and that applies even outside of the electoral campaign.
And that applies equally, through you, Madam Chair, that applies equally to that applies equally to the direct campaign as it would a third party?
Sorry, I'm not sure I understand the question, Madam
Chair. Can a third party take money that's been fundraised from outside of the country and use it for political purposes to influence political purposes and to influence election campaigns, leadership campaigns within the country?
So I'll try to be brief. In a direct way, the answer is no, they cannot do that. The difficulty, as I indicated when I testified, I believe, on Bill C-76, is although we have prohibitions, it's difficult to trace the source of funds for third parties. Third parties use funds that come from organizations that may come from other organizations and so forth. So there is not a disclosure of the original sources back to individual donors being Canadian citizens or permanent residents, as there is for parties and candidates. Now, doing that raises difficult issues from a charter point of view. I can certainly say that this is something that I'm looking into. I will be making recommendations to Parliament somewhere in April, and I do intend to address and propose some avenues.
Perfect. That's what I was going to get at, Madam Chair. I was going to ask if some recommendations would be forthcoming with respect to how something like that could be handled with. I know I have 30 seconds left. If one was so inclined to open an investigation into this, how does that happen?
It starts with a complaint to the Commissioner of Canada Elections referencing facts that relate to a particular offense under the Act. So that is the way forward for that.
Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Gerritsen. Monsieur Barcelou Duval, avez-vous la parole?
Merci.
You have the floor, Mr. Barcelou Duval. Mr. Perrault, thank you, Madam Chair. I'd like Mr. Perrault to explain to us how does it exactly work to have the feedback between the ridings, between the chief electoral officer, the commissioner, so that people are satisfied at the local level with what has happened? I ask you this question because there have been complaints from election to election, 2015, 2021. There have been people in villages, for example, who complain that they have to go to a neighboring village to vote when they already have a polling station in their own village. And some have had to travel as much as 40 minutes by car to be able to vote when they had a polling station already. This complaint has been there for the past 3 elections. In a city, you can walk 2 minutes and you can go and vote because you're in an urban environment. But it's frustrating for people who are not in an urban environment. They know that they can't vote where they live and they have to go to a neighboring village. Madam Chair, this is an issue that we're very aware of. We've done a lot of work on it to prepare the 2019 election. And I must say, in the state of a pandemic, it's been very difficult as well. You have to look to be sure that insofar as possible, the voters don't have to take a car or walk enormous distances to go vote at a polling station. We examine the proximity of a polling station, not just as a bird flies, but as a person walks and displaces themselves. Now, with respect to 2021, it was more complicated than 2019 because there was the issue of volume, and it could have happened that the closest polling station, polling place, was already being used to full capacity. So it's something that is very complex in the context of a pandemic. I can say that we do have tools in place that will allow us to look at that more attentively and to minimize this type of disruption. If you have specific cases, I ask you to bring them to my attention. I'm sorry. I should have said that to you, Madam Chair. Sorry. Of course. I think that that's something that all members of Parliament, if they have things to share, should also share with your office. Thank you, Mr. Barcelou Duval. We will continue with Madame Blaney now. You have the floor.
Chair, and I just want to state that I was really impacted by the questions of Mr. Viss. I had an opportunity to drive through parts of his riding during the forest fires, and it was quite shocking, the impact that it had on that area. And that leads me to the question that I would like to ask through you, Madam Chair, is Elections Canada actually starting to explore how to adapt to the impacts of climate change? We have seen in BC in particular some significant rain that has provided huge flooding that isolated many of our communities. We saw the forest fires destabilize communities, send them out. I mean, if I had 15 minutes to save my life, I certainly wouldn't be thinking, must remember to bring my license so that I can go and vote. So with these changes happening, and we're seeing them, I'm just wondering if Elections Canada is actually putting any research and work into looking at how we can make sure that regardless of what happens, people continue to have their right to vote in these most extreme situations that can happen anywhere and shut down different parts of our country. How do we prepare to respond to that? Madam Chair, that's my question.
Thank you, Madam Chair, for the question. It is certainly something that struck us after not this election, but the prior election, where there were many storms and around Winnipeg in particular, but also out east. And we had to deploy people who were flown in from headquarters here in Ottawa to serve hydro workers who were being, helping out with the power outages in Winnipeg. And we realized then that the model that we had to serve those hydro workers, we had to have something called an election in a box, where we plan for the possibility of having to deploy resources and adjust to an election. Is it a complete, fail-proof system? Absolutely not. We certainly are aware of this, and every election we need to learn from those experiences. One of the challenges that you point out, and it's been pointed out by other members before, is the ID rules. So should we be able to relax voter ID rules in the case of electors who are displaced and may not have with them all of the ID requirements? We have not done that so far, and that's perhaps something that I need to consider. I have to say that I've not received evidence of that being a problem, but that may not be true, in the sense that there may actually have been problems. So we'll need to look into that particular aspect, but we do have some planning, some contingencies, and we have some teams that monitor the weather events during elections, and that prepare to adjust the service offerings as we look into the extreme weather events.
Ms. Blaney, you're always really good with time, and I know we won't start a new round. Is there another comment or question that you wanted to get in?
Well, thank you, Madam Chair. I really appreciate that. Just a quick question about the special ballots, the mail-in ballots. I'm just wondering how the return rate for 2021 was compared to previous elections. I mean, my riding was number 5 in the top 10. A lot of folks from BC, as you can see in the graphs that we got. I'm just wondering how strong was that return rate. Thank you, Madam Chair.
So there's the return rate and there's the late return rate. These are two separate questions, right? Some were not returned and some were returned but received late. We have a table in the report, table 4, that compares with the last election, and certainly there's a significant variation. There's much more. Overall, the late ballots are in the 43rd election were 1.5% compared to 7.1 in this election. So it's quite an increase, and certainly one factor is the duration of the election. It was 4 days longer. But as I think I indicated earlier on, there's a number of other elements at play that we can possibly work on to reduce those late ballots.
Thank you, Mr. Perreault. We will now head to Mr. Viss for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. And just following on Madame Blaney's questions about climate change, perhaps it would be prudent, Madam Chair, if Elections Canada reported back to this committee and explained more in regards to a natural disasters framework. I don't believe this will be the last time these types of events will take place in my riding or in many other places across Canada. Madam Chair, would Elections Canada be open to providing that to this committee?
Madam Chair, I certainly can. I'd be happy to testify to it or simply to provide that in writing.
Thank you. Madam Chair, the report noted there was a delay in issuing voter identification cards. In some contexts, they were arriving the week of the election. Madam Chair, does Elections Canada believe that voter participation would have been higher had the VICs been received in mailboxes across Canada at an earlier date? As the report mentions, VICs are a key way to both inform and educate Canadians on their right to vote and the time and place in which to do so. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Madam Chair, obviously, the lateness of the voter information cards is not something that we wish. I think it's important to have them early, but they are dependent on the ability to confirm a poll. So without those polls, they were delayed by 1 week. It's very difficult to establish causation in terms of voter participation. We have a survey from StatsCan that was released, I think, today, this morning or yesterday, showing some of the reasons for not voting. They're very, very similar to what we've seen in previous elections. So I don't have any data that would support that, but it doesn't mean that it's not important to have those cards in as early as possible.
Thank you, Madam Chair. The report noted that approximately 11.3% of voters were not registered, or 88.7% of electors who were registered. Of the 11.3% registered, Madam Chair, does Elections Canada know why they were not registered and why the number decreased, not a lot, but why the number was marginally lower for registered voters this election?
Thank you, Madam Chair. Certainly the overall coverage at 96% is around a historic high of the last election. So it has not varied much. Clearly, in the context of the pandemic, there were limits on revision activities. More was done through communications with voters, asking them to go online. But overall, the numbers in terms of coverage at 96% and accuracy at over 92% are very, very close to the historic high of the last election.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Would Elections Canada, through you, Madam Chair, just be able to clarify what Elections Canada means by revision activities?
Certainly. So there's a range of activities that take place both during the period, both in person and through communications. But in person, for example, typically we would go to long-term care facilities, student areas, or places where there's new buildings to go door to door and make sure that we adjust the National Register of Electors. These activities did not take place in the context of the pandemic. So we used other means through communications to update the register.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Madam Chair, how much time do I have remaining?
About a minute, but if you have a question, get your point.
I'll get a quick question in. Following on Mr. Gerritson's comments about foreign interference, the election report noted that there was increased scrutiny on the part of Elections Canada related to social media. It came to my attention during the election that in some cases, paid social media platforms were used to promote certain candidates. In some cases, those paid social media platforms were not based in Canada or were owned or operated by Canadians. Is it appropriate, Madam Chair, for non-Canadian citizens to use social media platforms from another jurisdiction outside of Canada to promote either a candidate or a political party during an election?
Madam Chair, I think it's important to emphasize that it is important for Canadians and only Canadians to be paying for regulated activities. That is what the Act requires. It does not prevent Canadians from using platforms that may be situated elsewhere, but if any member has information regarding individuals outside of Canada who incurred regulated expenses in relation to the election, then please, I encourage anyone to bring that information forward to me or the Commissioner.
Thank you for that exchange. And now we will have our final speaker or questioner for this, for our time together, Mr. Turnbull.
Thanks, Madam Chair. Mr. Perot, I understand that perhaps there's been some pay delays with some of the staff that have worked within the 44th general election. Could you tell us a little bit about how those pay delays are being resolved and if there's any possibility of impact on people's desire in future elections to work for Elections Canada just based on those delays?
Through the chair. Mr. Perot, if you can make Mr. Turnbull a little bit easier for the last round. Thank you.
So there's excellent news and bad news in that regard. Overall, I think we're doing quite well. We have 98% of our workers that are paid within 4 weeks. I think that is extremely good, given the volumes that we have. The difficulty is with the remaining 2%. In every election, there are problems with the information that we have that may not be accurate. For example, a bank account that's not accurate. We are missing some information. And the challenge arises when the returning officers close their offices early and then do not have access to this information. It's locked up in sealed envelopes or boxes that are being shipped to headquarters, and they're just not possible to access. So there's always a bit of work, and it's really unfortunate for those that gave their time and expect that money. And so if there are still people out there, we do have a call center to manage those situations and make sure we deal with the exceptions. But they truly are exceptions, and they are based on missing or incorrect information that prevent the processing of money.
It sort of relates to my next question, Madam Chair, although not on the same track in terms of employee pay or pay for workers, but in terms of disinformation and misinformation. Previously, Mr. Perot, you spoke to some mostly online, and I think this was in regards to or in your response to Mr. Barrett's line of questioning earlier. Could you give some examples from the monitoring of what types of misinformation or disinformation was present online or typical?
So, I mean, there was quite a bit of content online, often not quite accurate. It may have to do with the rules of voting, with, whether it's permissible to bring your pen rather than use a pencil. It may have to do in some cases with the dates of voting. We saw a lot of misinformation regarding COVID rules applicable, some suggesting that you need to be vaccinated in order to vote. So this is the kind of misinformation that we actively try to correct, and we push out proper information and encourage all Canadians to turn to Elections Canada to find their correct information on ways to vote and how they vote.
Thank you, Mr. Perot. I appreciate that. And so was it an attempt in terms of to throw people off in terms of feeling like it was either safe to vote or, that they could actually vote? So it really was to deter people from voting? Would that be fair to say, or?
I think it's very difficult to impugn motivation when you see what's written online. There's a lot of confusion. There are conspiracy theories. Every election, we get a fairly significant amount of conversation around pencils being used to erase votes. We've disproved those many times, but they live out there. And by the way, you get the same stories when we speak to colleagues in the UK. They call it Pencilgate, and they're the same people who push the same information across borders and find their ways in different countries. So it's not clear what are the motivations in this case. If there were a case where we clearly saw an attempt to mislead voters, there are offences in the Act, and we'd refer them to the Commissioner. But we focus on getting the right information across more than looking at motivation.
Thank you, Mr. Perot. So through you, Madam Chair, my last question, if I have time. So we've seen over the last few weeks the Conservative Party support a convoy of occupants in our capital city, a convoy that really has a stated intention of overthrowing a democratically elected government. Do you have concerns about mainstream political parties supporting this type of anti-democratic rhetoric? And how do you propose that we can protect our democratic institutions in the future?
Point of order, Madam Chair.
Yes, Mr. Barrett?
Yeah, Madam Chair, I'm just wondering, you had mentioned previously to all members of the committee to be cautious about their choice of words and mindful that we invited folks to participate in a conversation with respect to the election laws in Canada. And your comments, Madam Chair, were made with a view to the ongoing debate that's happening in the House of Commons. And so, while Mr. Turnbull's comments seek to create a narrative indirectly that he would not be permitted to do so to make directly, I just wonder if it is germane to the conversation at hand. And obviously, Madam Chair, I reject the premise of the question. It's inflammatory intentionally. But I think that there's probably an opportunity to perhaps move on to constructive and on-topic questions for our guests.
Mr. Barrett, I appreciate your comments. I will just say my comments earlier were into the tone and temperament I would like to establish for PROC committee. And so I will just maintain my focus on this committee and how we operate. We know what the theme of today's committee meeting is, and I would remind members to stay on theme. And I do believe that there might be a diversity of perspectives on whether this is or not, but it is Mr. Turnbull's time, and I would like us to be able to complete this round of questioning. And Mr. Turnbull, I'm sure you find your comments and questions relevant, and if not, I'm sure you will course correct and get to relevancy always. Thank you,
Madam Chair. So through you to Mr. Perot.
So, Madam Chair, as you're well aware, we neither oversee or manage whether it's protest or occupation, and I'll leave others to qualify what's happening right now. Our role is not to comment or oversee what's happening that is outside of the election. I will note that 91% of Canadians trust the results of the election, the management of elections by Elections Canada. It's a very high number. I think it's important that this trust be maintained, as it is a guarantee of the peacefulness of the transition of powers or maintaining of powers, depending on the result of the election. And that is something that is very important to our democracy. And I will leave it at that.
Thank you, Madam Chair. And maybe I can just concur with Mr. Perot that I think protecting our democratic institutions is vitally important.
I write everything I do.
Okay, but it doesn't sound like
got some.
There is feedback. I'm not sure.
Yeah, just point of order, Madam Chair.
I'm just going to let Mr. Turnbull finish his comment, and I'll come right to you, Mr.
Well, it's a point.
Barrett.
It's a point of order, Madam Chair.
Mr. Barrett.
Yeah, Madam Chair, it's based on the response that the witness provided to Mr. Turnbull in question, going back to my previous point of order, that line of questioning created quite a bit of disorder in the room, which, speaks to the issue that I had raised with you before. So I'm being shouted down, Madam Chair. So there's a great deal of disorder in the room.
Mr. Barrett, I think you have made your point. I appreciate that.
I'd just ask that the room be brought to order, Madam Chair. Mr. Gerritsen and Mr. Turnbull are creating disorder.
Mr. Barrett, thank you. Mr. Turnbull, finish your comments and we will be at time.
Yes, thank you, Madam Chair. And I was just stressing the point that Mr. Perot made, which is how important the trust in our democratic institutions are, and certainly appreciate his hard work to protect one of our vital institutions. And it's just, it's too bad that we see political parties supporting anti-democratic rhetoric, and that's something that I think flies in the face of the great work that people like Mr. Perot do every day. Thank you very much.
Thank you. And that brings us to the end of round 3 and to almost the end of our time here together. And so I'm just going to, since we don't have another time for another round, I am going to ask Mr. Roussel if you have any comments you would like to share, and we'll give you 1 minute.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I do not have comments to add. Thank you.
Okay, and we do look forward to your work that you will be providing us in writing to Mr. Biss, as well as to other members who have made certain comments so that we can have that information. Mr. Pro, a 2-minute closing, maybe to summarize anything you've heard or you'd like to share.
Well, thank you for the opportunity, Madam Chair. I'm not going to try to attempt to summarize. I always do my best to support the work of the committee. I will be happy to provide additional information. If members want to speak to me bilaterally on an issue, I always welcome that as well. I understand that the committee will be undertaking a range of studies in the future, and it'll be called to testify then. And as I indicated, I do intend to make recommendations to Parliament later this spring, and I look forward to that opportunity as well.
Excellent, and I really appreciated that offer. When it comes to each of our ridings, we all have examples of things that took place, and we all want to see more people being able to exercise their democratic rights. So I would just reiterate that point that we should provide all insights we have to the Chief Electoral Officer and his team so that we can ensure that we continue to better our systems. With that, I would like to thank Mr. Pro and Mr. Roussel on behalf of all committee members for joining us here today for, I would say, a fruitful exchange of quite a variety of topics. It definitely demonstrates the importance of you being here with us today. And so we do appreciate your time and attention. Donc, nous souhaitons que vous restez en...
We want you to remain safe and healthy, and we will continue our work together.
Committee members, we have about 8 minutes left. If we would like any other comments shared amongst members, please let me know now. Otherwise, with your permission, we can adjourn our meeting. Anything from you, Mr. Duncan?
Have a wonderful afternoon, everybody.
Mr. Xavier Duval, Mr. Barcelou Duval.
Mr. Barcelou Duval, do you have any comments? Certainly, I would have had more comments for Mr. Perrault, but I'm going to respect the speaking time that we've all had, and I thank him for being with us. Thank you.
Well, I'm happy to second Mr. Duncan. Thank you so much to the witnesses. Through the chair.
Love it. Excellent. I will end it there because I think we're good to go. So thank you all. Have a good day. Keep on safe.
Merci, Madame la Présidente.